Good evening, all. I am excited to be with you tonight. It's Thursday evening. I am Pastor Abby Lightle. I serve as the Director of Family Life Ministry at Lightle United Methodist Church in Beaver Creek, Ohio. Last week I shared with you a bit about the fruits of the Spirit. I hope that if you caught that throughout the week, maybe some of those fruits of the Spirit entered your mind and you thought about how those are applicable and how we should be striving with the power of the Spirit to grow in each one of those. Because remember, those are not things, those fruits of the Spirit, that evidence that the Spirit lives within us, are not things that we develop and we perfect and we grow in on our own. But instead, as the scripture that I shared last week states, it is through the work and through the power of the Spirit within us. So I hope that throughout this past week, maybe you caught yourself where some of the fruits of the Spirit maybe were lacking a little bit, and we need to rely more on the Spirit to grow those within us, or perhaps there were moments when you were thankful for the power of the Spirit producing that fruit within you. Tonight I want to share briefly with you from the book of Psalm, chapter 105. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6 and 16 through 22. Hear these words from the book of the Psalm. Give thanks to the Lord and proclaim his greatness. Let the whole world know what he has done. Sing to him, yes, sing his praises. Tell everyone about his wonderful deeds. Exalt in his holy name. Rejoice, you who worship the Lord. Search for the Lord and for his strength. Continually seek him. Remember the wonders he has performed, his miracles and the rulings he has given. You children of his servant Abraham, you descendants of Jacob, his chosen ones. Verse 16, he called for a famine on the land of Canaan, cutting off its food supply. Then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar, until the time came to fulfill his dreams. The Lord tested Joseph's character. Then Pharaoh sent for him and set him free. The ruler of the nation opened his prison door. Joseph was put in charge of all the king's household. He became ruler over all the king's possessions. He could instruct the king's aides as he pleased and teach the king's advisors. Later in this chapter, it continues, the part that I read in verse 16 there talks about Joseph, who was sold into slavery, but later became this great leader. Further in the chapter, it talks about Moses, who was leading God's people out of Egypt. And then at the end, it talks about Joshua, who was helping establish his people in the land. And in each one of these instances, there's a promise from God being fulfilled. A promise fulfilled through Joseph, through Moses, through Joshua. But all of them are helping to fulfill these promises that God had made to the ancestors or to them directly. Joseph, Moses, and Joshua were challenged at times. They had difficulties. They had people against them. Joseph was in slavery. It wasn't an easy time for them. But they held on to the hope and held on to the promise that God had made. Sometimes, I remember when I was younger, the pinky promises, right? That was the strongest kind of promise you could make, was a pinky promise. Well, friends, a promise from God is 100 times more than a pinky promise. God's promises will be fulfilled. They may not always be fulfilled when we want them to be fulfilled, but God's promises hold true. And sometimes God seems far away from us. Sometimes it seems as if we are searching for God and we cannot find God. And we begin to doubt those promises. We begin to question those things that we believe that God has told us or God has led us to. And so in these moments, the first part of this chapter tells us what to do. Verse 5, it says, remember the wonders he has performed, his miracles and the rulings that he has given. In these moments when God seems far away, remember the things that God has done. Remember the promises made. Remember the promises fulfilled. Look back and remember who God is. Remember what God has done. You know, Jesus promised that everyone who seeks finds in Matthew chapter 7. It's a promise from Jesus. And this Psalm 105 is reminding us that God's promises will be fulfilled. God doesn't break pinky promises. When God seems far away, Psalm 105 is telling us to sing his praises and remember what has been done. Dive into the past, and we can dive into the past in our own life and consider the good things that God has given us. We can look at the lives of other believers. We can turn to Scripture and look at the goodness and the promises fulfilled from God in the past in the Scriptures. But friends, God's promises are true. God's promises are 1,000 times stronger than a pinky promise. There's all kinds of promises that God makes to us in Scripture. You know, I could spend hours reading you scriptures about God's promises for us, but my challenge to you tonight is to go find some of those. Find some promises of God. And if you have a scripture that reminds you of a promise of God, put it in the comments. Let us read these promises of God together throughout this next week. Come back to this video. If you find one tomorrow, if you find one Monday, come back to this video. Post it in the comments. Post it on your own page. Text it to somebody. Call them and say, hey, I found this really awesome scripture. Email it. Whatever it takes. This week, find promises of God in Scripture. If you don't have any idea where to look, Google's a great place to start. Just Google, what are God's promises? Because God promises us goodness. God promises to be with us. God promises provision and unconditional love, redemption, a prosperous life, strength, power through the Spirit. God's promises are true. God's promises are strong. And God's promises are promises. So this week, friends, my challenge is throughout this week, look up and find some promises of God in Scripture. What does God promise us? Reflect on your own life and look for those promises fulfilled. Journaling is a great way to kind of keep track of that. Journaling starting now and then every now and then go back and read, and you can see, I've done it, you can see where God's promises have been fulfilled. You can see where God is working. So throughout this next week, reflect on those promises fulfilled in your own life and dig into Scripture and find scriptural promises from God that you can cling to, especially in these moments when God may seem far. When you feel as if God isn't listening. When you're tired of waiting for promises to be fulfilled. Leaning on these scriptures of promise can renew that hope. Can help us to cling on a little bit longer. So anytime throughout this next week that you find a scripture of promise, share it with somebody. Post it, put it as a comment here, email, text, phone call, whatever it is. Share God's promises. Find them and share them with others. Because God's promises are 1,000 times stronger than any pinky promise you've ever made in your life.